None accepted. I want to fuck communism out of this little island, says a Marine, and fuck it right back to Moscow. Britain announced that it was sending a destroyer to assist in the rescue, said the American radio station to the Grenadian people the first morning. Not a half-truth, but a complete lie. Grenadians who heard the broadcast said they were a powerful encouragement to accept the occupation. The fighting was over in a week. 135 Americans killed or wounded, 84 Cubans, 400 Grenadians, more or less. The land conquered. There remained the people's hearts and minds. At the outset, the invasion radio station engaged in fiery attacks against Bishop. He had brought Grenada into captivity, said the announcer. But then the Americans evidently learned that this was a tactical error, that Bishop was still enormously popular, because for some time afterward, criticism of his regime was usually made more indirectly and without naming him. Before long, the Psychological Operations Battalion of the U.S. Army was cruising over the island in a helicopter offering the Grenadians, via a loudspeaker, a large serving of anti-Cuban fare. The Cubans had supported those who had killed Bishop, Grenada had been a pawn of Cuba, Castro/communism were still a threat, and so forth. Posters were put up showing alleged captured Cuban weapons with the slogan, "Are these the tools that build airports?" Other posters linked the MRC leaders to Moscow. In March 1984, a visiting London journalist could report, "The island remains visibly under American occupation. Jeeps patrol constantly. Helicopters fly over the beaches. Armed military police watch the villagers and frequent the cafes. CIA men supervise the security at the courthouse. The island's only newspaper pours out weekly vitriol about the years of the revolutionary government. This gruesome period in our history. The pressures in a small community are heavy. And in June we learned that schools called after heroes of the revolution had been given back their old names, though not without pupil protests. And the U.S. Information Service was showing school children a film entitled Grenada, Return to Freedom. The invasion was almost universally condemned in Latin America, only the military dictatorships of Chile, Guatemala, and Uruguay expressing support. The United Nations voted its disapproval overwhelmingly. To this, President Reagan responded, 100 nations in the UN have not agreed with us on just about everything that's come before them where we're involved, and it didn't upset my breakfast at all. One of the evils of communist states, we were always told, is that they were oblivious to world opinion. There was, however, the supreme irony that most of the people of Grenada welcomed the invasion. In addition to the conservative minority who knew that the socialist experiment would now be decisively put to rest, there were the greater number who were overjoyed to see the murderers of their beloved Maurice Bishop receive the punishment due them. Despite all the hostility and lies directed at Bishop by Washington for over 4 years, it did not seem to occur to the islanders that the invasion had nothing to do with avenging his death, and that the United States had merely used the event as a convenient pretext for an action it had desired to carry out for a long time. If the average Grenadian seems thus rather ingenuous with a short political memory, we must consider also that the average American lustily cheered the invasion, believed everything which crossed the lips of Ronald Reagan, as if this were the first U.S. intervention in history, and to this day would be hard-pressed to recite a single falsehood associated with the entire affair. The president himself later appeared to have completely repressed the incident. In March 1986, when asked about the possibility of an American invasion of Nicaragua, he replied, "You're looking at an individual that is the last one in the world that would ever want to put American troops into Latin America, because the memory of the great Colossus in the north is so widespread in Latin America. We'd lose all our friends if we did anything of that kind." On the 4th day of the invasion, Reagan made a speech which succeeded in giving jingoism a bad name. The president managed to link the invasion of Grenada with the shooting down of a Korean airliner by the Soviet Union, the killing of U.S. soldiers in Lebanon, and the taking of American hostages in Iran. Clearly, the invasion symbolized an end to the string of humiliations for the United States. Even Vietnam was being avenged. To commemorate the American Renaissance, some 7,000 U.S. servicemen were designated heroes of the Republic and decorated with medals. Many had done no more than sit on ships near the island. America had regained its manhood by stepping on a flea. Postscript. At the end of 1984, former Premier Herbert Blaise was elected Prime Minister, his party capturing 14 of the 15 parliamentary seats. Blaise, who in the wake of the invasion had proclaimed to the United States, "We say thank you from the bottom of our hearts," had been favored by the Reagan administration. The candidate who won the sole opposition seat announced that he would not occupy it because of what he called vote rigging and interference in the election by outside forces. 1 year later, the Washington-based Council on Hemispheric Affairs reported on Grenada as part of its annual survey of human rights abuses. Reliable accounts are circulating of prisoners being beaten, denied medical attention, and confined for long periods without being able to see lawyers. The country's new U.S.-trained police force has acquired a reputation for brutality, arbitrary arrest, and abuse of authority. The report added that an offending all-music radio station had been closed, and that U.S.-trained counterinsurgency forces were eroding civil rights. By the late 1980s, the government began confiscating many books arriving from abroad, including Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana and Nelson Mandela Speaks. In April 1989, it issued a list of more than 80 books which were prohibited from being imported. For months later, Prime Minister Blaise suspended Parliament to forestall a threatened no-confidence vote, resulting from what his critics called an increasingly authoritarian style. 46. Morocco 1983. A video nasty. The government of Morocco, in January 1983, had the sad duty to announce the grievous death in a car accident of General Ahmed Dlimi, a confidant of King Hassan for more than 20 years and commander of the Moroccan army's southern forces. When the Le Monde correspondent had the temerity to suggest that Dlimi's death was perhaps not an accident, he was summarily expelled from the country. Then, in March, Ahmed Rami, a Moroccan political scientist living in exile in Sweden, stated unequivocally that Dlimi had been murdered by Hassan and his security men, and that the CIA was deeply implicated. Ahmed Rami had been a lieutenant in the Moroccan army and a leader of Le Mouvement des Officiers Libres, the underground movement of army officers dedicated to overthrowing the king and the monarchy, as well as the king's personal corruption and his crimes against human rights. Rami was living abroad under sentence of death in Morocco for his part in a failed attempt to shoot down a plane carrying Hassan in 1972. The dissident officers supported the establishment of a democratic Islamic Arab Republic of Morocco and a negotiated settlement in the country's ruinous war with the Polisario guerrillas in the Western Sahara, a war in which U.S. military aid and personnel had reportedly enabled Morocco to maintain a deadlock. Ahmed Dlimi, while serving as the king's right-hand man, had been secretly associated with Officiers Libres. When he went abroad, he would meet with Rami, and during 1982, the two men were discussing plans for a coup attempt in July of the following year. Unknown to us, however, said Rami, the CIA was investigating him, Dlimi. When the CIA handed over a dossier to King Hassan in January 1983, it contained video film of General Dlimi and I meeting in Stockholm last December. That was enough for Dlimi to be eliminated. Morocco, said the New York Times, had become the United States' closest and most useful ally in the Arab world. Hassan had clearly tied his fortunes to the Reagan administration. In 1981 alone, he was visited by Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger and Secretary of State Alexander Haig, as well as the Deputy Director of the CIA, the Chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and a host of other high-level Washington officials. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security arrived with a team of 23 military advisors and experts. More than 100 Americans were reported to be working with the Moroccan armed forces. In the years previous, Hassan had cooperated extensively with U.S. policies in Africa. In both 1977 and 1978, he sent Moroccan troops to Zaire in support of the American actions there. And since the mid-1970s, he had been aiding the UNITA forces in Angola along with the United States and South Africa in their continuing effort to overthrow the MPLA government. At the same time, King Hassan had allowed the CIA to build up its station in Morocco to where it was probably one of the agency's key posts in Africa. In these and other important ways, Hassan had earned the gratitude and protection of the United States. Thus it was that the CIA exposed General Dlimi's double life to the king. Dlimi, moreover, had reportedly advocated that Morocco receive aid from France, the former colonial power, rather than from the United States. The CIA saw this as a threat to the American position in the country and insisted that Hassan get rid of his confidants who favored closer relations with France. At 11 o'clock on the night of January 23, 1983, says Ahmed Rami, Dlimi was called to the palace in Marrakesh. There, 10 security men escorted him to an underground interrogation room. At 1 a.m., 2 American officers arrived with the king and went into the interrogation room for several hours. Dlimi was tortured, and at 5 a.m. he was shot. His body was later placed in his car, which was exploded in a suburb of the city. No one, not even his family, was allowed to see the body. 47. Suriname 1982 to 1984. Once again, the Cuban bogeyman. It was unusual, to be sure, that the director of the CIA would inform Congress in advance of an agency plan to overthrow a foreign government. President Reagan, said William Casey to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees in December 1982, had authorized the CIA to try to topple Suriname ruler Colonel Desi Bouterse. The agency's plan reportedly called for the formation of an exile paramilitary force to invade Suriname because Bouterse, who had taken power in a 1980 military coup, was leading the small South American country into the proverbial and dreaded Cuban orbit. The congressional committee members, while not opposed in principle to the idea of attempting to overthrow a foreign government, did object to the proposal on the grounds that there was no evidence that Cuba was manipulating the government in Suriname or gaining a military foothold in the country. Inasmuch as rational argument of this sort had never made too deep an impression upon the mind of Ronald Reagan or excessively inhibited the CIA, there was no reason to believe that this was the end of the story, or even the beginning. 2 months earlier, in October, the Bouterse regime had threatened to expel 2 U.S. diplomats it accused of encouraging the country's conservative trade unions and of playing a key role in organizing anti-government demonstrations and strikes aimed at bringing the government down. Then, on December 8th, Suriname announced that a coup attempt had been made against the government. A number of alleged plotters were arrested, some of them winding up shot while trying to escape, evidently a euphemism for their execution. Bouterse claimed that the arrested men had been conspiring with the CIA. One of those who lost his life was conservative union leader Cyril Dahl, who had helped organize anti-government demonstrations earlier in the year and who was said to have connections with the CIA through his Motorbond Unions Association with the CIA's ubiquitous American Institute for Free Labor Development, AIFLD. The following month, the 2 U.S. diplomats were actually asked to leave because of their destabilizing activities. In July 1983, the plot thickened. The New York Times reported that an invasion of Suriname scheduled for the first of the month by Florida-based mercenaries was called off after the plans for it were discovered by the Internal Security Agency of the Netherlands, the former colonial power in Suriname when it was known as Dutch Guiana. The invasion force reportedly would have been composed of some 300 men, half of them U.S. and South American nationals, the others Surinamese, who were to be flown from Florida to the Suriname capital of Paramaribo on the northern tip of South America. The invaders were then to be augmented by Surinamese exiles from the Netherlands. It was this latter group which the Dutch had infiltrated to learn of the plans. As had become customary concerning American targets in Latin America, stories about the presence of large numbers of Cuban soldiers in Suriname found their way into international circulation. Like their counterparts in Jamaica and Grenada, these warriors remained mythical figures. In spring 1983, Suriname entered into agreements with the neighboring right-wing government of Brazil, which provided for economic and military aid and military training. By the reasoning of the Reagan administration, Suriname should then have been in the Brazilian orbit. The simple truth was that Suriname, like other developing nations, was willing to accept help from wherever it could get it. And in fact, Brazil, which openly admitted that its purpose was saving Suriname from Cuba, had made the move at Washington's prodding. As matters turned out, in October Bouterse expelled almost all Cuban advisors and embassy personnel, including the ambassador, and suspended all agreements with Havana. The expulsion was announced on the day the United States invaded Grenada and was influenced by Bouterse's belief that Cuba had played a part in the overthrow of Maurice Bishop and that he might suffer a similar fate, if not a similar invasion. This belief about Cuba, as we have seen, bore no relation to the truth and may have been encouraged by the United States. Newsweek magazine later reported that U.S. diplomats in the capital of Paramaribo made sure to keep Boudersey current on evidence that Cuba had aided the Grenadian coup, and the rest was left to his well-prepped paranoia. Desi Boudersey, by all accounts, left much to be desired as a leader and as a person. Long before the events of October, Cuba and Grenada were reported to be privately irritated, even angry, at the harm done to the left's image in the region by what they see as immature revolutionaries leading a premature revolution. Although Boudersey had learned to parrot socialist and anti-imperialist cliches, his principles appeared to lie elsewhere. In the words of one diplomat in Suriname, Boudersey is a chameleon. The first thing for him is his own personal survival. The second thing is his survival as the man in charge. Boudersey was accused at times of claiming plots against him as a pretext to get rid of some of those opposed to his rule. Several other coup attempts were alleged in addition to the one of December 1982 mentioned above. During the period December 1983 to January 1984, Suriname was shaken by thousands of striking workers protesting against tax increases and steep price rises, and calling for the dismissal of Prime Minister Errol Alibux. Serious acts of sabotage to power and water supplies were carried out as well. Boudersey gave in, removing Alibux and canceling the price rises, but he did not accede to the demand that the military hand power back to civilians. Although the scenario was reminiscent of CIA activities in British Guiana, Jamaica, and elsewhere, as well as what the Suriname government had accused the United States of in October 1982, there is no report of the agency's hand in the disturbances of this period. However, in 1985 it was revealed that the National Endowment for Democracy, which is financed by Congress to support foreign organizations sympathetic to U.S. foreign policy objectives, had been funding organizations in Suriname during the 1983 to 85 period. 48. Libya 1981 to 1989. Ronald Reagan meets his match. The great masses of the people in the very bottom of their hearts tend to be corrupted rather than consciously and purposely evil. Therefore, in view of the primitive simplicity of their minds, they more easily fall a victim to a big lie than to a little one, since they themselves lie in little things, but would be ashamed of lies that were too big. Adolf Hitler. Our evidence is direct, it is precise, it is irrefutable, announced the President of the United States. He was explaining that the American bombing attack upon Libya of April 14th, 1986 was in retaliation for the Libyan bombing 9 days earlier of a West Berlin nightclub frequented by American servicemen, which had killed 2 soldiers and 1 civilian and injured many others. In actuality, the evidence of Libyan culpability in the bombing was never directly or precisely presented to the world, but little notice was taken of that. For over a decade, the American public had been told that Libyan leader Muammar al-Gaddafi was behind one terrorist act after another in every part of the world. A few days before the American attack, President Reagan had referred to him as the mad dog of the Middle East. This was just one more example. It all fit. The bombs dropped on Libya took the lives of a reported 40 to 100 people, all civilians but one, and wounded another 100 or so. The French embassy, located in a residential district, was destroyed. The dead included Gaddafi's young adopted daughter and a teenage girl visiting from London. All of Gaddafi's other 7 children, as well as his wife, were hospitalized, suffering from shock and various injuries. It was not claimed by the United States that any of the people killed or wounded had any connection to the Berlin bombing. Like the Mideast terrorists who threw hand grenades at an LL ticket counter to kill Israelis simply because they were Israelis, and those who planted a bomb on Pan Am Flight 103 in order to kill Americans simply because they were Americans, the bombing of Libya was an attempt to kill Libyans simply because they were Libyans. After the air attack, White House spokesman Larry Speakes announced that it is our hope this action will preempt and discourage Libyan attacks against innocent civilians in the future. The Libyan the United States most wanted to kill, of course, was Gaddafi. The bombing had been an assassination attempt, said a well-informed Air Force intelligence officer, cited by the New York Times. There's no question they were looking for Gaddafi. It was briefed that way. They were going to kill him, which is what you have to do with a mad dog. Subsequently, 2 of Gaddafi's children filed suit in the United States to stop President Reagan from launching more assassination attempts on their family. The suit, which was rejected in court, alleged that Reagan and other top officials, in ordering the raids, had violated an executive order that bars attempted assassinations of foreign government leaders. Another suit filed in Washington was in behalf of 65 people killed or injured by the bombing. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was awarding 158 medals to the pilots who dropped 500-pound and 2,000-pound bombs in the dark of night upon sleeping people. The notion of targeting Gaddafi's family originated with the CIA, which claimed that in Bedouin culture Gaddafi would be diminished as a leader if he could not protect his home. If you really get at Gaddafi's house, and by extension his family, you've destroyed an important connection for the people in terms of loyalty. To make sure the Libyan people got the message, the Voice of America repeatedly told them, following the bombing, things like, "Colonel Gaddafi is your tragic burden, and that as long you obey his orders you must accept the consequences." The president's claim of irrefutable evidence was based on alleged interceptions of communications between the Libyan capital of Tripoli and the Libyan embassy in East Berlin. Reagan declared that on March 25th, Libya had sent orders to the embassy to conduct a terrorist attack against Americans, to cause maximum and indiscriminate casualties. Then the embassy alerted Tripoli on April 4th that the attack would be carried out the next day, that Tripoli will be happy when you see the headlines tomorrow, and that after the bombing the embassy reported that the action had been successful and could not be traced to it. These are, at best, interpretations and paraphrases. The complete, unedited, unexpurgated, literal texts of the relevant communications were not made public. They were intercepted by the National Security Agency and decoded with the help of the German BND, Federal Intelligence Service, which had broken the Libyan code years before. After the decoding was completed, reported Der Spiegel, Germany's leading news magazine, it was still not clear what the wires actually said, there being different versions. Moreover, the NSA and BND came to different conclusions about the meaning of the messages, but these disagreements were quickly pushed aside for political reasons. German security officials, who insisted that Libya should not be the only focus of investigation and who cautioned against a premature accusation, also looked into rival groups of disco competitors and drug dealers. In January 1987, a senior official in Bonn told investigative reporter Seymour Hersh that the German government continued to be very critical and skeptical of the American position linking Libya to the bombing. And at the end of the following year, Germany announced that the investigation was being ended. Some White House officials had immediate doubts that the case against Libya was clear-cut, Hersh reported. What is more, the discotheque was known as a hangout for black soldiers, and the Libyans had never been known to target blacks or other minorities. As in many other instances that we have seen, however, official Washington's official position, repeated often enough, became official truth. 3 years after the incident, Time magazine could state matter-of-factly that Libyan-backed terrorists bombed a disco in West Berlin, thereby provoking the American retaliatory bombing. Much of Washington's secret planning for the Libyan operation took place at the same time as the secret talks and arms dealing with Iran. Thus, the Reagan administration was pursuing the elimination of one Middle East source of terrorism while it was arming another. Moreover, the two missions involved some of the same national security people, notably John Poindexter and Oliver North. Although the Carter administration did not carry out any overt military attacks upon Libya, it was possibly involved in a very serious covert action. On June 27, 1980, an Italian passenger plane was destroyed by a missile over the Mediterranean, taking 81 lives. At the same time, a Libyan plane which may have been carrying Gaddafi was flying in the vicinity. Italian air controllers listed it as a VIP 56 flight, denoting that top officials were aboard. In 1988, Italian state television reported that the plane had been mistakenly shot down by a missile belonging to a NATO country, possibly Italy. A year later, an Italian Defense Ministry report revealed that it was probably a Sidewinder air-to-air missile that was used, a weapon employed by NATO. The Italian press began speculating that a plan to assassinate the Libyan leader had gone awry, and instead the Italian plane had been shot down by a NATO power. At the time of the disaster, Gaddafi had hinted that the United States was responsible. The US and France, Libya's chief foes, issued denials, as well as NATO itself, but the Italian military was taking great pains to conceal information about the case. Nevertheless, an Air Force officer admitted to destroying the radar tape for that evening, and a civilian investigation suggested that many Air Force personnel were persuaded to lie or forget about the incident. Ronald Reagan and his ultra-ideological comrades took office in January 1981, committed to a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. One of the pivotal ways in which they so artfully reached this end was through huge increases in the military budget, i.e., welfare for the rich, for defense industry friends and business associates, past, present, and future. But in order for the military-industrial intelligence complex to sell this to the American public and Congress, there had to be a fresh supply of wars, armed conflict, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, or rumors and threats of same, and enemies, ideally of the monster type, to be defended against. Gaddafi was a designer monster, a quirky, unpredictable, super-uppity third-world leader, sitting on the world's ninth largest oil reserve. A man with deep-seated pan-Islamic, pan-Arabic, anti-Zionist, and anti-imperialist convictions, who had closed a strategic U.S. airbase in Libya in 1970. An artless braggart mouthing revolutionary rhetoric so juvenile he could serve equally well as bogeyman or buffoon. A man carrying out or supporting enough real terrorist acts so that any exaggeration would be believed. There were elements of a bitter personal feud between the two men. Ronald Reagan, a man who played with airstrikes as if he were directing movie scenes, had chosen to take on a man who, like himself, was a prisoner of ideology and had left his mark on the world media with a trail of dogmatic observations and actions, as well as plain stupid remarks. All of the great prophets of modern times, Gaddafi said, have come from the desert and were uneducated. Muhammad, Jesus, and myself. The Libyan leader, however, did have a social conscience, not a quality known to be part of Ronald Reagan's DNA. You don't see poverty or hunger here. Basic needs are met to a greater degree than in any other Arab country. Reported Newsweek in 1981 about Libya. Gaddafi's principal crime in Reagan's eyes was not that he supported terrorist groups, but that he supported the wrong terrorist groups. I.e., Gaddafi was not supporting the same terrorists that Washington was, such as the Nicaraguan Contras, UNITA in Angola, Cuban exiles in Miami, the governments of El Salvador and Guatemala, and the U.S. military in Grenada. The one band of terrorists the two men supported in common was the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. Some of the belligerent American operations against Gaddafi, actual and threatened, and charges of Libyan terrorism, actual and fabricated, were timed to stir up American jingoist juices when Congress was debating the military budget or aid to Reagan's favorite terrorists, whom he called freedom fighters. The April 14, 1986 bombing of Libya, for example, came one day before the House opened a new round of debate on aid to the Contras. Then, speaking on the 15th, Reagan said, "I would remind the House voting this week that this arch-terrorist Gaddafi has sent $400 million, sick, and an arsenal of weapons and advisors into Nicaragua." Very shortly after taking office, Reagan announced the appointment of a special group to study the Libyan problem. The State Department appeared to have two schools of thought: diplomatic pressure on Gaddafi or a more confrontational view. Nobody, one official pointed out, advocates being nice to him. Soon a master plan had been drawn up by the CIA, which Newsweek exposed in August 1981. A large-scale, multi-phase, and costly scheme to overthrow the Libyan regime and obtain what the CIA called Gaddafi's ultimate removal from power. The plan called for a disinformation program designed to embarrass Gaddafi and his government, the creation of a counter-government to challenge his claim to national leadership, and an escalating paramilitary campaign of small-scale guerrilla operations. The escalation was immediate. On August 19th, American planes crossed Gaddafi's line of death, the 120-mile limit claimed by Libya in the Gulf of Sidra, and shot down two Libyan jets. The United States, which considered it international waters, as did most of the rest of the world, although this concept is more debatable when applied to aircraft than when applied to ships, purposely chose the area to conduct military exercises. As expected, Libya rose to the bait, at least according to Washington, which claimed that the Libyan planes had fired first. An enraged Gaddafi accused the U.S. of international terrorism, and, in a phone call to the leader of Ethiopia, reportedly threatened to assassinate Reagan. An official who served in a national security position under Reagan responded that there was no question that the only thing to do with Gaddafi was kill him. He belonged dead. Soon the U.S. media were reporting a barrage of Gaddafi death threats against the life of Reagan or other senior officials. In October, a story appeared that the American ambassador to Italy was hastily flown out of the country after Italian authorities discovered a Libyan plot to assassinate him. That was aborted when Italian police deported 10 suspected Libyan hitmen. But some American officials in Washington and Rome disputed the story, while another government source confirmed it. A month later, there was a report of an attempt upon the life of an American diplomat in Paris. 7 shots were fired at Christian Chapman, but he escaped unharmed. That same day, Secretary of State Alexander Haig, who referred to Gaddafi as the patron saint of terror, suggested that Libya was behind the attempt, although he admitted that he had no other information directly implicating Libya. But Chapman had recently received some threats, said the French government, some of which had been traced to Tripoli. A New York Times analysis of the incident, however, concluded that something less than an organized assassination attempt might have been involved. In late November, the administration announced that a number of terrorists trained in Libya had entered the United States with plans to assassinate President Reagan or other officials. This prompted a huge nationwide search for the Libyan hit squad and for Americans to whom they might turn for assistance, including the Weather Underground. Then the infamous international terrorist Carlos was brought into the picture, and the administration said that it had received first-hand descriptions from informers of the training and plans of the terrorists. Each day new and ominous details arose in the media, which had already forgotten the exposure in August of the initiation of a government disinformation campaign against Libya. "We have the evidence," Reagan told newsmen, "and he, Gaddafi, knows it." Reporters pressed the White House to make the evidence public, but were refused. Some officials, however, including some senior FBI officials, were said to be skeptical about the reports. Syndicated columnist Jack Anderson then described what a shadowy, unreliable group the suppliers of the hit squad information were, adding that several of them were known to have connections with Israeli intelligence, which would have its own reasons to encourage a US-Libyan rift, there being a deep and mutual animosity between Israel and Gaddafi. In mid-1981, a task force under William Clark, Deputy Secretary of State, had been set up to look into the whole Gaddafi issue. Years later, Seymour Hersh was to report. According to key sources, there was little doubt inside Clark's task force about who was responsible for the spate of anti-Gaddafi leaks: the CIA, with the support of the President, Haig, and Clark. This item, the Libyan hit squad, stuck in my craw, one involved official recalls. "We came out with this big terrorist threat to the US government. The whole thing was a complete fabrication." One task force official eventually concluded that CIA Director William Casey was in effect running an operation inside the American government. He was feeding the disinformation into the intelligence system so it would be seen as separate, independent reports and taken seriously by other government agencies. As matters turned out, most of the presumed assassins were Lebanese who had helped Reagan negotiate the release of US hostages in Beirut and who hated Gaddafi. When the story's purpose had been served, it faded away. However much some of Gaddafi's reported threats were disinformation, there were real plans by the West to kill him. A February 1981 French plot, with US cooperation under discussion, had to be cancelled when French President Giscard was unexpectedly defeated at the polls. In 1984, it went further, with the CIA sharing highly sensitive intelligence, including satellite photographs and communications intercepts, with the French Secret Service to aid them in at least 2 major, but unsuccessful operations to assassinate or overthrow Gaddafi, who was perceived by the French as a threat to what they thought of as their interests in Africa. One of the operations resulted in a pitched battle in Libya between exiles and Gaddafi loyalists. And in 1985, the State Department had to go to great lengths to head off a White House-sponsored plan for a joint US-Egyptian land and air invasion of Libya. Secretary of State George Shultz called the plan crazy, while his department colleagues referred to the freewheeling staff of the National Security Council as those madmen in the White House. At Christmas of that year, after bomb attacks at the Rome and Vienna airports killed about 20 people, including 5 Americans, all the usual suspects were quickly accused, with Iran and the Palestinian splinter group of the nefarious Abu Nidal heading the list. The Reagan administration soon added Gaddafi, announcing that the CIA had found a strong Libyan connection, when all they had was that the Tunisian passports of 3 of the terrorists had purportedly been traced to Libya. Within days, Reagan declared that there was irrefutable evidence of Gaddafi's role in the airport bombings, although he knew that this was not true. At the same time, new economic sanctions against Libya were announced, to get economic sanctions out of the way so the next time we could do more. The next time was in March 1986. US Navy jets again crossed Gaddafi's line of death, daring retaliation. When there wasn't any, they returned the next day and the day after, twice attacking a Libyan anti-aircraft site and destroying 3 or 4 ships. Washington asserted that on the second day, Libya had first fired several missiles at the American planes. Shortly afterward, one of a group of British electronics engineers working in Libya at the time was interviewed by the Sunday Times of London. The engineer said that he had been watching the radar screens during the 2 days of fighting and saw American warplanes cross not only into the 12 miles of Libyan territorial waters, but over Libyan land as well. I watched the planes fly approximately 8 miles into Libyan airspace, said the engineer. I don't think the Libyans had any choice but to hit back. In my opinion, they were reluctant to do so. Following the first American attack in March on Libya, Gaddafi spoke on the phone with King Fahd of Saudi Arabia, who subsequently told US officials that the Libyan leader appeared deeply affected by the violence unleashed against him. The king described Gaddafi as incomprehensible and disoriented, a description similar to other reports which appeared during the 1980s which spoke of a very depressed Gaddafi who didn't seem to understand what the United States had against him. Before and after the events of March, he made half a dozen attempts through third parties to open a dialogue with Washington, but Reagan administration officials rebuffed them all. The would-be European and Arab mediators, including King Fahd, were firmly told that the United States was not interested either in a direct or indirect dialogue with Gaddafi. That at least was the official policy the face turned to the public. There were, however, reports that the White House was secretly dealing with the Libyan leader. To what extent is not known. The only certain contact was a November 1985 visit with Gaddafi in Libya by the US ambassador to the Vatican, William Wilson. The meeting was disavowed by official Washington as being unauthorized, and Wilson lost his post after it was disclosed. Meanwhile, and throughout the term of the Reagan administration, the United States was increasing military assistance to Libya's immediate neighbors and conducting military exercises with Egypt designed to provoke Gaddafi, instituting diverse forms of economic sanctions against Libya with varying degrees of ineffectiveness, trying to unify Libyan exile opposition groups and giving them financial support and encouragement. The same to the governments of Egypt and France for various anti-Gaddafi actions, not excluding assassination. It should be noted that France, the United States' chief anti-terrorism partner, in 1985 deliberately sank the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior, killing a Greenpeace photographer. This with the express approval of French President François Mitterrand. Disinformation was a regular part of the process, using the foreign and American press to publicize fictitious new Libyan terrorist plans and to announce, with each new terrorist act that occurred in the Western world, that Libya may be responsible. To make Gaddafi believe that key trusted aides were disloyal, that the Libyan military was plotting against him, that his Russian military advisors were plotting against him, that his troops were deserting en masse, or that a new US military attack was on the horizon, a process they hoped would push the man into irrational acts. His imminent downfall was predicted as regularly as that of Castro. One operation involved Navy SEAL commandos landing on Libyan beaches and leaving telltale signs of the incursions, such as matchboxes and Israeli cigarette butts, to make the Libyans nervous, ever more paranoid. An August 1986 memo from John Poindexter, the president's national security advisor, which spelled out some of the disinformation program, mentions itself that at the time Gaddafi was quiescent on the terrorist front. Shortly afterward, a key Reagan administration official admitted to American reporters that if pressed for hard evidence of the charges against Libya, they wouldn't have any. It will look like we're crying wolf once again. In response to the Poindexter memo, the exposure of which had caused a mini-scandal, the senior spokesman for the State Department, Bernard Kalb, resigned in protest because he was worried about faith in America, American credibility, and anything which hurts America. The issue spilled over to the British, whose officials described US intelligence analyses about Libya's intentions as wildly inaccurate, which they said were passed to the British in a deliberate effort to deceive. In this same period, in light of new US news reports engendered by the Poindexter memo, of possible further strikes against Libya in retaliation for terrorist actions allegedly being planned by Gaddafi's regime, Libya's effective prime minister called upon the United States to furnish details on the alleged actions so that Libya could cooperate fully to avert and abort such attacks and apprehend the individuals and put them on trial. He said that his request, sent to Washington through diplomatic channels, had gone unanswered. The next day, Gaddafi, in a speech in Libya, challenged the United States to produce bank statements showing that Libya financed terrorism. "Half the lies they tell about the Irish aren't true," a son of Aaron once observed. The regular employment of disinformation about Gaddafi and Libya by the United States so clouded the historical picture that it is extremely difficult in most cases to separate fact from fiction, to distinguish Libyan moral or token backing or simply promises to a revolutionary movement from major, vital support. The fact that the Reagan administration felt the need to undertake disinformation campaigns against Libya indicates a paucity of smoking guns. On September 1st, 1969, Captain Muammar el-Gaddafi had led a group of fellow officers in a bloodless overthrow of the monarchy and established the Libyan Arab Republic. Despite his troublemaking abroad, he initially kept in the good graces of the West, the US thwarting several serious plots against his rule during his first 2 years, because of his fierce anti-communism, which stemmed basically from his taking Marxism's implicit atheism at face value and viewing it as irreconcilably at odds with his Islamic faith. But this did not keep him from trying to institute revolutionary social and economic changes in Libyan society which others called Marxist. This, plus entering into oil development and arms agreements with the Soviet Union, may have spelled the beginning of the end for the West's tolerance of his foreign adventures. During the 1970s and 80s, Gaddafi was accused of using his large oil revenues to support, with funds, arms, training, offices, havens, diplomacy, and/or general subversion, a wide array of radical/insurgent/terrorist organizations, particularly certain Palestinian factions and Muslim dissident and minority movements in various parts of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, as well as the IRA and Basque and Corsican separatists in Europe. Several groups engaged in struggle against the apartheid regime in South Africa, Noriega in Panama, opposition groups and politicians in Costa Rica, St. Lucia, Jamaica, Dominica, and France's Caribbean colonies of Guadeloupe, French Guiana, and Martinique, the Japanese Red Army, the Italian Red Brigades, Germany's Baader-Meinhof Gang. The list is without end. It was claimed as well that Libya was behind, or at least somehow linked to, the attempt on Pope John Paul's life, the assassination of Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, mining the Suez Canal, attempting to blow up the US Embassy in Cairo, various plane hijackings, a bomb explosion on an American airliner over Greece, blowing up a synagogue in Istanbul, and seeking to destabilize the governments of Chad, Liberia, the Sudan, and other African countries. And Gaddafi took drugs, was an extreme womanizer, was bisexual, dressed in women's clothing, wore makeup, carried a teddy bear, had epileptic fits. More established is the fact that for several years Gaddafi made use of former CIA staffers, notably Edwin Wilson and Frank Turpel, to supply him with aircraft and pilots, mechanics, and Green Beret instructors, all manner of sophisticated weaponry, equipment, and explosives, and to help set up paramilitary training camps in Libya. And Amnesty International, in 1987, concluded that Libya had carried out attacks on at least 37 anti-Gaddafi dissidents abroad since 1980, with 25 being killed. In January 1989, the State Department added to Gaddafi's credits by asserting that Libya was funding and training radical individuals and groups whose activities exacerbate local problems in Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, Japan, and New Caledonia. A few months earlier, the CIA had accused Libya of building the largest poison gas plant in the world. In March 1990, a fire broke out at the plant in question and burned it to the ground. President Bush immediately and personally assured the world that the United States absolutely had nothing to do with the fire. A week earlier, the White House spokesman had been asked if the US might take military action to destroy the plant. "We don't rule out anything," was the reply. And in Chicago, members of a street gang were convicted in late 1987 of planning terrorist activities. U.S. prosecutors charged that the gang expected to receive $2.5 million from Libya for assassination attempts on American politicians and for attacks on U.S. aircraft and government facilities. That, in its entirety, is how the Los Angeles Times reported it, and it sounded like the bizarre Libyan strongman was at it again. In actuality, assassination, planned or concrete, was not one of the charges, and no evidence at all was presented at the trial that Libya had anything to do with originating or encouraging these acts, or had paid or promised any money. The El Rukn gang members, a Muslim sect and naive in the extreme, had met with Libyan representatives in New York, Panama, and Libya, and pathetically tried to impress them with their prowess and loyalty to Gaddafi. They had been inspired by Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan purportedly receiving a Libyan promise of $5 million. If El Rukn received a promise of $2.5 million, and we have only their word for it, it would appear that both promises were no more than Gaddafi's revolutionary self-indulgence. The IRA also claimed that they had not received any money from Libya, contrary to Gaddafi's claim. It is perhaps a measure of the hostility toward Libya that had been inculcated in the American people for more than a decade, that the gang members, through government use of a questionable informer and through entrapment, were found guilty by a jury of federal conspiracy charges and sentenced to extraordinarily long sentences. It was reportedly the first time ever that U.S. citizens had been convicted on terrorism charges. It is like a grade B horror movie. A dozen times it rises from the dead and lurches towards the audience. A dozen times it is cut to ribbons, staggering back, collapsing in a heap, and a dozen times it rises again and clomps slowly forward. But it is not the mummy's ghost, and it is not haunting the Upper Nile. It is the notion that the Libyan leader, Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, is responsible for every act of terrorism in the entire world, and it haunts the pages of the Western press and the screens of Western television sets. Pan Am Flight 103. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing 270 people, more than half of them Americans. 5 months later, the State Department announced that the CIA was confident that the villains who planted the bomb were members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command, PFLPGC, led by Ahmed Jibril, based in Syria, and hired by Iran to avenge the American shooting down of an Iranian airliner. Though little could be done to apprehend Jibril and his cohorts, this remained the US government's official, certain, and oft-repeated judgment, even though Syria and Iran were viewed as the keys to the release of Western hostages held in Lebanon. Then, in 1990, something strange happened. The United States was preparing to go to war against Iraq, when who should pop up as one of its allies, sending troops to Saudi Arabia in the jihad against Saddam Hussein? None other than the terrorist haven land of Syria, and whose cooperation in the war was Washington angling for? The wicked Iran. This would not do. In early October, American officials declared that newly uncovered evidence indicated that Libyan intelligence agents may have assembled and planted the bomb. But this, they were quick to point out, did not clear Iran, Syria, or the PFLPGC of complicity. After the war, little by little, a putative case against Libya was leaked, until November 14, 1991, when 2 Libyan intelligence operatives were indicted in absentia as the perpetrators. The head of the Justice Department's criminal division asserted the same day that there was no evidence to link either Syria or Iran to the bombing, and he brushed aside suggestions that the conclusion had been influenced by the United States' desire for improved relations with Syria. Within the next 20 days, the remaining 4 American hostages held in Lebanon were released along with the most prominent hostage, Britisher Terry Waite. And the evidence against the 2 Libyans? 2 pieces of metal the size of fingernails, allegedly from electronic timing devices. One has to read the detailed account of what the case against Libya rests upon to appreciate its full shakiness. Moreover, in December 1993, a BBC program, Silence Over Lockerbie, presented new findings which cast significant doubt about the case against Libya and indicated that Britain and the United States may have fingered Libya to divert suspicion from Syria and Iran. The key new information was that the Swiss manufacturer of the electronic timers changed his previous story, which had named Libya as the only purchaser of such devices. He now remembered that he had sold some of the timers to East Germany as well. There were close links between the East German secret police and the PFLPGC and other Arab terrorist groups. Even more significant, an engineer with the Swiss company declared that he had told the Lockerbie investigators about the East German connection in late 1990, which means that the international investigators knew that their accusation against Libya had a large, if not fatal, hole in it either before the accusation was made public in October or shortly thereafter. No German judge could, with the present evidence, put the two suspects into jail, declared Volker Rath, German government prosecutor and specialist in Lockerbie, in 1994. Postscript: in 2003, the Libyan government accepted responsibility for the 1988 bombing, without admitting to an actual role in the event, in the hope of ending US and UN sanctions. Libya agreed to this because in 2001 a Libyan had been found guilty in a trial in The Hague of having planted the bomb. This trial, however, was widely regarded as a farce. The new Gaddafi? It may be that the oft-oppressed Muammar el-Gaddafi finally began to understand, finding his way past the verbiage and the disinformation, what the United States and other governments had against him. In the latter half of 1988, he seemed to grow up, instituting a host of progressive changes into Libyan society, freeing up civil liberties, releasing hundreds of political prisoners, removing restrictions on travel abroad, loosening up the economy. All Libyans are called upon to become bourgeois. At the same time, making peace or improving relations with a number of African neighbors. But as the year 1989 opened and Washington prepared to shift from Ronald Reagan to George Bush, the United States marked the occasion by conducting some more military exercises in Libya's backyard and shooting down 2 more Libyan planes. The State Department then saw fit at this particular time to issue its most detailed account to date of Libyan involvement in international terrorism, an attempt to maintain international pressure on Libya, wrote the Los Angeles Times. Nonetheless, Gaddafi continued to display his new persona. He announced that he had decided to cut off or trim the flow of funds to various foreign groups, and he told several Palestinian groups that they would no longer receive direct funding from his government and would have to close their offices in Libya. He also admitted that Libya had bankrolled terrorist groups, but said that it no longer did so. When we discovered that these groups were causing more harm than benefit to the Arab cause, we halted our aid to them completely and withdrew our support, adding that he did not wish for any confrontation with Washington. The United States was not impressed with any of this. It may have felt that it had nothing to gain by relaxing its crusade against Gaddafi, but it did have an enemy to lose. 49. Nicaragua 1978 to 1990. Destabilization in slow motion. I have the most conclusive evidence that arms and munitions in large quantities have been on several occasions shipped to the revolutionists in Nicaragua. I am sure it is not the desire of the United States to intervene in the internal affairs of Nicaragua or of any other Central American republic. Nevertheless, it must be said that we have a very definite and special interest in the maintenance of order and good government in Nicaragua at the present time. The United States cannot, therefore, fail to view with deep concern any serious threat to stability and constitutional government in Nicaragua tending toward anarchy and jeopardizing American interests, especially if such state of affairs is contributed to or brought about by outside influence or by any foreign power. In this manner did President Calvin Coolidge address the Congress of the United States in 1927. The revolutionaries he was voicing alarm about were those supporters of the Liberal Party, one of whom was Augusto Cesar Sandino, who had taken up arms against the Conservative Party government which they claimed was illegally in office. The foreign power accused of arming the liberals was the Mexican government, which the Coolidge administration viewed as being impregnated with Bolshevist ideas. The American interests thought to be in jeopardy were the usual business investments, flaunted more openly in those days than later. Thus it came to pass that the Marines landed in Nicaragua for the 12th time in less than 3/4 of a century. See Appendix 2. In the 1980s, it was the revolutionary Nicaraguan government of the Sandinistas which alarmed the administration of Ronald Reagan, who described Coolidge as his political patron saint. The foreign power castigated for arming the Sandinistas was the Soviet Union, impregnated with Bolshevist ideas to be sure. The counter-revolutionaries known as the Contras were Washington's Marines. As to American interests, to the rationality of economic imperialism had been added a desire for political hegemony bordering on the pathological. When the American military forces left Nicaragua for the last time in 1933, they left behind a souvenir by which the Nicaraguan people could remember them. The National Guard, placed under the direction of one Anastasio Somoza, just as in 1924 the United States had left Trujillo behind for the people of the Dominican Republic. 3 years later, Somoza took over the presidency and with the indispensable help of the National Guard established a family dynasty which would rule over Nicaragua, much like a private estate, for the next 43 years. While the Guardsmen, consistently maintained by the United States, passed their time on martial law, rape, torture, murder of the opposition, and massacres of peasants, as well as less violent pursuits such as robbery, extortion, contraband, running brothels, and other government functions, the Somoza clan laid claim to the lion's share of Nicaragua's land and businesses. When Anastasio Somoza II was overthrown by the Sandinistas in July 1979, he fled into exile, leaving behind a country in which two-thirds of the population earned less than $300 a year. Upon his arrival in Miami, Somoza admitted to being worth $100 million. A U.S. intelligence report, however, placed it at $900 million. It was fortunate for the new Nicaraguan leaders that they came to power while Jimmy Carter sat in the White House. It gave them a year and a half of relative breathing space to take the first steps in their planned reconstruction of an impoverished society before the relentless hostility of the Reagan administration descended upon them, which is not to say that Carter welcomed the Sandinista victory. In 1978, with Somoza nearing collapse, Carter authorized covert CIA support for the press and labor unions in Nicaragua in an attempt to create a moderate alternative to the Sandinistas. Towards the same end, American diplomats were conferring with non-leftist Nicaraguan opponents of Somoza. Washington's idea of moderate, according to a group of prominent Nicaraguans who walked out on the discussions, was the inclusion of Somoza's political party in the future government and leaving practically intact the corrupt structure of the Somocista apparatus, including the National Guard, albeit in some reorganized form. Indeed, at this same time, the head of the U.S. Southern Command, Latin America, LT, General Dennis McAuliffe, was telling Somoza that, although he had to abdicate, the United States had no intention of permitting a settlement which would lead to the destruction of the National Guard. This was a notion remarkably insensitive to the deep loathing for the Guard felt by the great majority of the Nicaraguan people. The United States, moreover, tried, unsuccessfully, to convince the Organization of American States to send in a peacekeeping force, a body which could only have stood in the way of the insurgents' military progress. And in neighboring Costa Rica, the American ambassador saw fit to complain to the government that Cuba had set up a center to oversee its military support of the Sandinistas, resulting in the Cubans being forced to move their headquarters to their consulate. After the Sandinistas took power, Carter authorized the CIA to provide financial and other support to their opponents. At the same time, Washington pressured the Sandinistas to include certain men in the new government. Although these tactics failed, the Carter administration did not refuse to give aid to Nicaragua. Ronald Reagan was later to point to this and ask, "Can anybody doubt the generosity and good faith of the American people?" What the president failed to explain was, almost all of the aid had gone to non-governmental agencies and to the private sector, including the American Institute for Free Labor Development, the longtime CIA front. In 1981, the U.S. Solicitor General, while arguing before the Supreme Court, inadvertently touched upon the link between the AIFLD and the CIA. When this was picked up by the press, he lamely said that he had been speaking hypothetically. The primary and expressed motivation for the aid was to strengthen the hands of the so-called moderate opposition and undercut the influence of socialist countries in Nicaragua. All military aid was withheld despite repeated pleas from the Nicaraguan government about its need and right to such help. The defeated National Guardsmen and other supporters of Somoza had not, after all, disappeared. They had regrouped as the Contras and maintained primacy in the leadership of this force from then on. In January 1981, Ronald Reagan took office under a Republican platform which asserted that it deplores the Marxist Sandinista takeover of Nicaragua. The president moved quickly to cut off virtually all forms of assistance to the Sandinistas, the opening salvos of his war against their revolution. The American whale, yet again, felt threatened by a minnow in the Caribbean. Among the many measures undertaken, Nicaragua was excluded from U.S. government programs which promote American investment and trade. Sugar imports from Nicaragua were slashed by 90%, and, without excessive subtlety but with notable success, Washington pressured the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, the World Bank, and the European Common Market to withhold loans to Nicaragua. The director of the IDB, Mr. Kevin O'Sullivan, later revealed that in 1983 the U.S. had opposed a loan to aid Nicaraguan fishermen on the grounds that the country did not have adequate fuel for their boats. A week later, O'Sullivan pointed out, saboteurs blew up a major Nicaraguan fuel depot in the port of Corinto, an action described by an American intelligence source as totally a CIA operation. Washington did, however, offer $5.1 million in aid to private organizations and to the Roman Catholic Church in Nicaragua. This offer was rejected by the government because, it said, United States congressional hearings revealed that the aid agreements have political motivations designed to promote resistance and destabilize the revolutionary government. Nicaragua had already arrested members of several of the previous recipient organizations, such as the Moravian Church and the Superior Council of Private Enterprise, COSEP, for involvement in armed plots against the government. The Reagan administration was not deterred. Cardinal Miguel Obando and the Catholic Church in Nicaragua received hundreds of thousands of dollars in covert aid from the CIA until 1985, and then, after official U.S. government aid was stopped by congressional oversight committees, from Oliver North's off-the-books operation in the White House basement. One end to which Obando reportedly put the money was religious instruction to thwart the Marxist-Leninist policies of the Sandinistas. As part of a concerted effort to deprive the Nicaraguan economy of oil, several attacks on fuel depots were carried out. Contra/CIA operations emanating in Honduras also blew up oil pipelines, mined the waters of oil unloading ports, and threatened to blow up any approaching oil tankers. At least 7 foreign ships were damaged by the mines, including a Soviet tanker with 5 crewmen reported to be badly injured. Nicaragua's ports were under siege. Mortar shelling from high-speed motor launches, aerial bombing, and rocket and machine gun attacks were designed to blockade Nicaragua's exports, as well as to starve the country of imports by frightening away foreign shipping. In October 1983, Esso announced that its tankers would no longer carry crude oil to Nicaragua from Mexico, the country's leading supplier. At this point, Nicaragua had a 10-day supply of oil. Agriculture was another prime target. Raids by Contras caused extensive damage to crops and demolished tobacco drying barns, grain silos, irrigation projects, farmhouses, and machinery. Roads, bridges, and trucks were destroyed to prevent produce from being moved. Numerous state farms and cooperatives were incapacitated and harvesting was prevented. Other farms still intact were abandoned because of the danger. And in October 1982, the Standard Fruit Company announced that it was suspending all its banana operations in Nicaragua and the marketing of the fruit in the United States. The American multinational, after a century of enriching itself in the country, and in violation of a contract with the government which extended to 1985, left behind the uncertainty of employment for some 4,000 workers and approximately 6 million cases of bananas to harvest with neither transport nor market. Nicaragua's fishing industry suffered not only from lack of fuel for its boats. The fishing fleet was decimated by mines and attacks, its trawlers idled for want of spare parts due to the U.S. credit blockade. The country lost millions of dollars from reduced shrimp exports. It was an American war against Nicaragua. The Contras had their own various motivations for wanting to topple the Sandinista government. They did not need to be instigated by the United States. But before the U.S. military arrived in Honduras in the thousands and set up Fortress America, the Contras were engaged almost exclusively in hit-and-run forays across the border, small-scale raids on Nicaraguan border patrols and farmers, attacks on patrol boats, and the like. Killing a few people here, burning a building down there, there was no future for the Contras in a war such as this against a much larger force. Then the American big guns began to arrive in 1982, along with the air power, the landing strips, the docks, the radar stations, the communication centers, built under the cover of repeated joint U.S.-Honduran military exercises, while thousands of Contras were training in Florida and California. U.S. and Honduran reconnaissance planes, usually piloted by Americans, began regular overflights into Nicaragua to photograph bombing and sabotage targets, track Sandinista military maneuvers and equipment, spot the planting of mines, eavesdrop on military communications, and map the terrain. Electronic surveillance ships off the coast of Nicaragua partook in the bugging of a nation. Said a former CIA analyst, "Our intelligence from Nicaragua is so good, we can hear the toilets flush in Managua." Meanwhile, American pilots were flying diverse kinds of combat missions against Nicaraguan troops and carrying supplies to Contras inside Nicaraguan territory. Several were shot down and killed. Some flew in civilian clothes, after having been told that they would be disavowed by the Pentagon if captured. Some Contras told American congressmen that they were ordered to claim responsibility for a bombing raid organized by the CIA and flown by agency mercenaries. Honduran troops as well were trained by the US for bloody hit-and-run operations into Nicaragua, and so it went as in El Salvador. The full extent of American involvement in the fighting will never be known. The Contras' brutality earned them a wide notoriety. They regularly destroyed health centers, schools, agricultural cooperatives, and community centers, symbols of the Sandinistas' social programs in rural areas. People caught in these assaults were often tortured and killed in the most gruesome ways. One example, reported by The Guardian of London, suffices. In the words of a survivor of a raid in Jinotega province, which borders on Honduras, Rosa had her breasts cut off. Then they cut into her chest and took out her heart. The men had their arms broken, their testicles cut off, and their eyes poked out. They were killed by slitting their throats and pulling the tongue out through the slit. America's Watch, the human rights organization, concluded that the Contras systematically engage in violent abuses, so prevalent that these may be said to be their principal means of waging war. In November 1984, the Nicaraguan government announced that since 1981, the Contras had assassinated 910 state officials and killed 8,000 civilians. The analogy is inescapable. If Nicaragua had been Israel and the Contras the PLO, the Sandinistas would have long before made a lightning bombing raid on the bases in Honduras and wiped them out completely. The United States would have tacitly approved the action. The Soviet Union would have condemned it but done nothing. The rest of the world would have raised their eyebrows, and that would have been the end of it. After many Contra atrocity stories had been reported in the world press, it was disclosed in October 1984 that the CIA had prepared a manual of instruction for its clients which, amongst other things, encouraged the use of violence against civilians. In the wake of the furor in Congress caused by the exposé, the State Department was obliged to publicly condemn the Contra's terrorist activities. Congressional intelligence committees were informed by the CIA, by present and former Contra leaders, and by other witnesses that the Contras indeed raped, tortured, and killed unarmed civilians, including children, and that groups of civilians, including women and children, were burned, dismembered, blinded, and beheaded. These were the same rebels whom Ronald Reagan, with his strange mirror language, called freedom fighters and the moral equal of our founding fathers. The rebels in El Salvador, in the president's studied opinion, were murderers and terrorists. The CIA manual, entitled Psychological Operations in Guerrilla Warfare, gave advice on such niceties as political assassination, blackmailing ordinary citizens, mob violence, kidnapping, and blowing up public buildings. Upon entering a town, it said, establish a public tribunal where the guerrillas can shame, ridicule, and humiliate Sandinistas and their sympathizers by shouting slogans and jeers. If it should be necessary to fire on a citizen who was trying to leave the town, guerrillas should explain that he was an enemy of the people who would have alerted the Sandinistas, who would then carry out acts of reprisals such as rapes, pillage, destruction, captures, etc. The Contras were advised to explain to the people that our struggle is not against the nationals, but rather against Russian imperialists. This will foster the sympathy of the peasants, and they will immediately become one of us. Mao himself couldn't have put it better. Workers were to be told that the state is putting an end to factories, and doctors informed that they are being replaced by Cuban paramedics. When the population sees the light and begins to rise against the government, professional criminals should be hired to carry out selective jobs, such as taking the demonstrators to a confrontation with the authorities to bring about uprisings and shootings that will cause the death of one or more people to create a martyr for the cause. Other people will be armed with clubs, iron rods, and placards, and, if possible, small firearms, which they will carry hidden. Still other shock troops, equipped with knives, razors, chains, clubs, and bludgeons, will march slightly behind the innocent and gullible participants as the uprising progresses. Finally, a section called Selective Use of Violence for Propagandistic Effects informed the Contra student that it is possible to neutralize carefully selected and planned targets, such as court judges, police, and state security officials, and others. Throughout, the manual reads like what the Western world has always been taught is the way communists scheme and indoctrinate. It proved intensely embarrassing to the Reagan administration, not least because it unequivocally punctured the official balloon which had been floating about bearing the message that the United States was not pursuing the overthrow of the Sandinista government. Although at that late date, anyone who still believed that was far enough removed from reality to continue believing it. White House officials and President Reagan twisted their tongues into knots trying to explain away the manual. The manual made public was only a first draft, which was not the one distributed. They said falsely. The word neutralize didn't mean to assassinate, only to remove from office. The author of the manual was some low-level, irresponsible freelancer. Not long afterward, the manual, with minor changes, could be found in distribution again in Honduras, put out ostensibly by a private American organization, Soldier of Fortune magazine. The CIA may have tried to provide its students with some object lessons in neutralization of the mafia kind. In June 1983, the Nicaraguan government expelled 3 U.S. embassy officials, one of whom was reported to be the CIA's chief of station in Managua, charging them with being part of an agency destabilization network which, amongst other things, was attempting to assassinate Foreign Minister Miguel Descoto. The intended murder weapon was to be a bottle of Benedictine liqueur containing thallium, a poison almost undetectable in the human body. At a press conference, the government presented evidence which included photos and videotapes of American diplomats meeting with the Nicaraguan officials who had pretended to go along with the plot, as well as copies of intercepted CIA messages. 2 months later, another agency plot to kill Descoto, who is also a Roman Catholic priest, as well as 2 other Sandinista officials, was alleged by the Nicaraguan government. A CIA agent named Mike Tock was charged with being behind this particular conspiracy. The following June, according to one of the participants, the CIA sent a contra-hit team from Honduras to Managua to do away with all 9 commandantes of the Sandinista National Directorate in one fell swoop by blowing up the building they were meeting in. The team made it to Managua, but the explosives failed to arrive and the plot was aborted. The Lord and the fight for freedom have something in common. They both move in mysterious ways. If the CIA's guerrilla manual was not an odd enough tool of liberty, the agency's comic book surely was. Entitled Freedom Fighter's Manual, the 16-page booklet was supplied to Contra forces presumably to distribute amongst the Nicaraguan population. Its 40 illustrations showed the reader how he could liberate Nicaragua from oppression and misery by a series of useful sabotage techniques. Amongst these were stop up toilets with sponges, pull down power cables, put dirt into gas tanks, put nails on roads and highways, cut and perforate the upholstery of vehicles, cut down trees over highways, telephone to make false hotel reservations and false alarms of fires and crimes, hoard and steal food from the government, leave lights and water taps on, steal mail from mailboxes, go to work late, call in sick, short-circuit electricity, break light bulbs, rip up books, spread rumors, threaten supervisors and officials over the phone. Until at least the mid-1980s, the primary official explanation for American belligerence towards the Sandinista government, at least the explanation most frequently advanced, was that a significant quantity of military supplies was being sent to the Salvadorian rebels from Nicaragua. The fact that the United States was at the same time heavily arming the Salvadorian government, and that the Salvadorian government was assisting the Contras did not enter into Washington's equation. We shall see in the chapter on El Salvador how lacking in evidence Washington was in support of this charge. Whatever organized supply operation of any significance that had existed appears to have ended in early 1981. In January of that year, a Salvadorian cabinet minister announced that Nicaragua was no longer allowing its territory to be used for arms shipments. A few weeks later, the Sandinista government, alarmed by the suspension of U.S. economic aid, pressed the Salvadorian guerrillas to seek a political settlement. Similar requests were made by the Sandinistas during the following years. And in March, in a meeting at CIA headquarters of Director William Casey and others, the cessation of the supply operation was confirmed. David McMichael, who served with the CIA from 1981 to 1983 as an analyst of military and political developments in Central America, attended an interagency meeting held to discuss CIA plans to support the Contras. Of this meeting, he noted that, Although the stated objective was to interdict arms going into El Salvador, there was hardly any discussion of the arms traffic. I couldn't understand this failure until months later when I realized, like everyone else, that arms interdiction had never been a serious objective. The former CIA man said that he had had access to the most sensitive intelligence on Nicaragua, including arms shipments to El Salvador, based on which he concluded that the administration and the CIA have systematically misrepresented Nicaraguan involvement in the supply of arms to Salvadorian guerrillas to justify their efforts to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. For a man who spent 10 years as an officer in the U.S. Marine Corps and 4 years as a counterinsurgency expert in Southeast Asia, in addition to his tour of service at the CIA, David McMichael's political thinking about U.S. foreign policy in Latin America landed in strange territory. We have control and we don't want to lose it. The ideology of anti-communism then provides the rationalization, although this determination to hold on is actually pathology. Then you have an entire generation of people raised in the foreign policy establishment and specializing in this region who for 25 years have gotten up in the morning and said, "We'll get that bastard Castro today." The failure of the United States to show large Nicaraguan tracks on the Salvadorian landscape apparently led the ubiquitous Oliver North to try and place some artificial footprints in the ground. In 1988, Jose Blandon, a former close advisor to Panama's defense chief and de facto ruler, General Manuel Noriega, stated that North had set up a secret operation in 1986 that called for Panama to arrange a large shipment of Soviet bloc arms and vehicles that could be captured in El Salvador and falsely linked to the Sandinistas. The effort collapsed in June when the ship carrying the military goods was seized by Panamanian officials, 2 days after the New York Times had published an article concerning illegal activities of Noriega. Washington's explanation number 2 put forth for its policy appeared to be that Nicaragua was a military threat to other Central American countries, not simply to the bases in Honduras, which were a daily, calculated provocation, but to Honduras itself and the other nearby states. This was a weak reed to lean on, for Nicaragua had virtually no air force, and it would have been suicidal to attack anyone without proper air cover. Even less of a navy, and its tanks were demonstrably unsuitable for the terrain of Honduras. Still less did the Sandinistas have a sane reason for invasion. It is questionable whether the men of the State Department believed this story themselves, any more than did the supposed neighboring targets. At a conference for journalists in Costa Rica in 1985, the Costa Rican Minister of Information, Armando Vargas, said cheerfully, "No one here really expects Nicaragua to invade us. And nobody in Honduras does either," said Manuel Gamero, the editor-in-chief of Tiempo, one of that country's leading newspapers. On other days, we were told other reasons why the Sandinistas had to be restrained. It may have been to protect the Panama Canal, SIC, or the free use of the sea lanes in the Caribbean Basin and the Gulf of Mexico. The danger to the sea lanes bit has been trotted out by Washington for every corner of the globe in the past 40 years. Not once has it materialized. Or it may have been the threat of another Cuba, or its corollary, a Soviet beachhead in the region. These warnings came complete with pictures, an exhibition of aerial photos of Nicaragua showing Cuban-style military barracks, a Soviet-style physical training area with chin bars and other types of equipment to exercise the forces, and a running track. And, most damning of all, a Sandinista garrison having a standard rectangular configuration like we have seen in Cuba. Leave it to those cunning Castroites to devise a rectangular building. The strategic issue is a simple one, asserted Patrick Buchanan, Reagan's director of communications. Who wants Central America more, the West or the Warsaw Pact? Fidel Castro was not in any doubt. On at least 2 occasions he expressed in no uncertain terms his frustration and annoyance with the Soviet Union for not sufficiently aiding Nicaragua, and for what he saw as the Russians' weak and indecisive response to American pressure against the Sandinista government, even in the face of a Russian ship being damaged by CIA mines. The Cuban leader failed to attend the funeral of Soviet leader Chernenko in March 1985 and did not sign the book of condolences at the Soviet embassy in Havana, apparently to register his displeasure with Soviet policy, responded a Soviet diplomat. "We obviously place a priority on improving relations with our adversary. We have to seek a balance with the US, so naturally we will say to the Cubans, calm down. We are not interested in sharpening the situation in Angola and Nicaragua." In the think tanks and the academic institutes in Moscow where Soviet policy towards Central America is discussed and debated, reported The Guardian of London. The emphasis is on dialogue and negotiation, and if the Soviet Union agrees on one thing with the United States, it is that there should be no more Cubas, a reference to the heavy economic and political burden Cuba had placed upon Moscow over the years. Oliver North was not in any doubt either as to who wanted Central America more. Said the lieutenant colonel to one of the private American contributors to the Contras. Russia would never go up against us to save Nicaragua. Neither was Poland in doubt. The Warsaw Pact members sold arms to the Contras, as did the Communist Chinese. In 1987, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev offered to end Soviet military aid to Nicaragua if the United States ended its military support of the Contras. Reagan confirmed that Gorbachev had raised this matter with him, but there is no indication that the president followed up in any way. In January 1983, the so-called Contadora Group, composed of Mexico, Panama, Colombia, and Venezuela, began to meet periodically in an attempt to still the troubled waters of Central America. Rejecting at the outset the idea that the conflicts of the region could or should be seen as part of an East-West confrontation, they conferred with all the nations involved, including the United States. The complex and lengthy discussions eventually gave birth to a 21-point treaty, which dealt with the most contentious issues: civil war, foreign intervention, elections, and human rights. Washington, which was not itself to be a signatory to the treaty, though obviously indispensable to its implementation, pressed Managua to sign, partly for domestic consumption. Congressional support of the administration's Nicaragua policy and the 1984 presidential elections, and partly to be able to take jabs at Nicaragua, saying that it would make the country a democracy and halt their export of revolution. Then, much to Washington's surprise, on September 7, 1984, Nicaragua announced its intention to sign the treaty. Until this moment, the United States had not publicly criticized the treaty's provisions, but immediately Washington began to find things wrong with it and called for changes. The State Department declared that the Contadora Group didn't intend that this treaty document be the end of the process, but a high-ranking diplomat from one of the Contadora countries insisted that everyone had treated it as a final document from the beginning, as had the U.S. representatives. What alarmed Washington about the treaty was its provisions for the removal from each country of all foreign military bases, restrictions on foreign military personnel, armaments, and military exercises, and a prohibition on aid to insurgent forces seeking to overthrow a government. It was enough to put an interventionist power out of business. The United States refused to give its blessings to the agreement, commented Rep. Michael Barnes, chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere. The administration's objections to the treaty reinforce my belief that it's never had any real interest in a negotiated settlement. After the Managua announcement, State Department officials admitted that they were concerned that it might undermine the administration's efforts to portray the Sandinistas as the primary source of tension in Central America. Some officials argued that a trip scheduled by Sandinista leader Daniel Ortega to Los Angeles should not be approved, in part to punish Mr. Ortega and the Sandinistas for accepting the Contadora peace proposal. Nicaragua's willingness to sign the treaty was labeled a propaganda ploy. 1 month later, an internal National Security Council paper was able to note that the United States, through intensive lobbying efforts, had effectively blocked adoption of the treaty as it was written. During the following 3 years, the Reagan administration successfully sought to thwart the peace talks among the Contadora Group because the talks complicated administration attempts to win funds for the Contras in Congress, as well as working against their primary goal of toppling the Nicaraguan government. National Security Advisor John Poindexter let Panama strongman General Manuel Noriega understand that the United States did not appreciate Panama's role in the Contadora process and suggested that Noriega step down from power. When Noriega refused, the U.S. cut off $40 million in economic assistance. Then, in June 1986, Washington officials briefed American journalists about Noriega's involvement in drug trafficking and money laundering. Thus was a CIA client in good standing suddenly transformed into public enemy number one in the United States. Similarly, in 1985, when Honduran President Roberto Suazo impeded Contra aid shipments, the U.S. blocked an aid package to Honduras and leaked some dirt about Suazo. In February 1986, The US threatened Mexico, which was, along with Panama, the most active member of the Contadora group, that if it lobbied Congress on behalf of the Contadora process, the administration would throw its support behind the opposition National Action Party, PAN, in upcoming Mexican elections. Convicted Contragate player Carl Chanel later told representatives of PAN that Reagan would help them if they helped the Contras. In an extremely unusual move, administration officials went before Congress in May to denounce the Mexican government for corruption, drug trafficking, and economic mismanagement. In August 1987, a Central American peace accord, generated by President Oscar Arias of Costa Rica as a successor to the unsuccessful Contadora process, was signed by Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Its key provisions concerning foreign military intervention were similar to those in the various Contadora versions. The Reagan administration, however, still had its heart set on a military victory. According to former officials, some in the administration wanted to see the failure of peace talks convened under the Arias Plan. The war in Nicaragua continued. The argument most often advanced by the Reagan administration to explain its reluctance to accept a Contadora agreement during 1983 and 1984 was that Nicaragua was not prepared to hold a truly free election as called for by the treaty. Washington labeled the election held in November 1984, which the Sandinistas won by a 2-to-1 margin, a sham. On the face of it, by the flawed standards of Western elections, the Nicaraguan election cannot be much faulted. By the standards of Latin America, it was a veritable paragon of democracy. The fact that there were no deaths reported in connection with the election by itself made it rather unique in Latin America. The appearance of minor parties on the ballot in every department state of the nation distinguished it from the typical presidential election in the United States. The election was open to all parties and candidates. No fraud in the polling was reported or even seriously charged. It was observed by a reported 400 foreigners from 40 different countries, and on election day the Washington Post could report. Even U.S. diplomats here acknowledge that the Sandinistas have allowed expression of a wide range of political views, including some that were harshly critical of the government. The Sandinistas eased censorship of the sole opposition newspaper, La Prensa, at the start of the campaign, and the state television and radio channels have given airtime, although limited, for the small but vocal opposition parties to make their case. Washington's criticism of the election centered on the boycott of it by the Democratic Coordinating Alliance, DCA, a significant coalition of opposition groups headed by Arturo Jose Cruz. On several occasions, Cruz and his followers were physically harassed by crowds when they appeared in public, and on at least one occasion it was reported that many of the protesters had been brought to town in government vehicles. Whether the Sandinistas deliberately intended to harass Cruz or discourage him from running is not clear. What is clear is that the government had much more to lose than to gain by keeping the DCA off the ballot. In any event, harassment of a serious nature appears to have been short-lived and did not remain as a stumbling block to Cruz running. The DCA's most persistent stated objection was that not enough time had been allowed for campaigning. The chronology of events is as follows. The November 4th election date was announced on February 21st. In May, registration of parties and candidates was set for July 25th, at which time 7 parties registered. The Sandinistas, 3 parties which could be considered to their left, and 3 to their right. The DCA declined to register, and Cruz announced that he would not run unless the government opened a dialogue with the Contras, as if the Contras had been fervently demanding this for some time, only to be rebuffed by the government. The DCA dropped this request 3 weeks later, stating that the Contras had told them they would abide by any accord reached between the party and the government. The failure to register, it should be noted, occurred before any special harassment had taken place. Cruz also contended at this time that for 5 years the population had been too indoctrinated by the government for the opposition to stand a chance, a charge which could be made with considerable validity by any opposition party in any nation of the world. The day of registration, several of Cruz's aides met with the government and asked that the deadline for registration be extended, a move indicating perhaps a split in the DCA ranks. The Sandinistas at first refused, but on September 22nd announced that registration was being extended to October 1st. The DCA again failed to register, stating that the election date had to be moved from November to January. The Sandinistas suspected, and said so openly, that the DCA knew it would lose anyway and was abstaining from the election at the behest of the United States in order to throw a question mark over the whole process. In August, some of Cruz's backers had in fact stated that they hoped to discredit the election and force the Sandinistas to grant political concessions. What we really need, they declared, is Arturo in jail. One unmistakable sign of the CIA's hand in the election was the full-page advertisements which appeared in August in newspapers in Venezuela, Costa Rica, and Panama, signed by a fictitious organization called Friends of Tomas Borga. The ads attempted to split the Sandinista leadership by promoting Borga's candidacy over that of Daniel Ortega, who had already been chosen as the Sandinista candidate. Neither Ortega nor Cruz, proclaimed the ads. Throughout this period, the DCA made one demand after another concerning electoral procedures as its price for taking part in the election. By any reasonable standard of power relationships, the government showed itself to be flexible. On September 21st, the New York Times reported that the opposition had stated that the Sandinistas had made substantial concessions and that the only major proposal left was postponing the election until January. This was important, said the DCA, because the campaign could not have properly begun before certain things had been agreed upon. The government's position was that it would grant the postponement, a major concession and inconvenience, only if the DCA would arrange a ceasefire with the Contras. The party replied that it didn't have the power to do so, and negotiations continued through all of October with many confusing and contradictory reports coming out of the talks until, finally, time ran out. The United States could certainly have arranged a ceasefire if it was interested in testing the Sandinistas' commitment to what Washington would call a free election. That the U.S. had such an interest is questionable in light of what the New York Times revealed 2 weeks before the election. The Reagan administration, while publicly criticizing the November 4th elections in Nicaragua as a sham, has privately argued against the participation of the leading opposition candidate for fear his involvement would legitimize the electoral process, according to some senior administration officials. Since May, when American policy toward the election was formed, the administration has wanted the opposition candidate Arturo Jose Cruz either not to enter the race or, if he did, to withdraw before the election, claiming the conditions were unfair, the officials said. The administration never contemplated letting Cruz stay in the race, one official said, because then the Sandinistas could justifiably claim that the elections were legitimate, making it much harder for the United States to oppose the Nicaraguan government. Several administration officials who are familiar with the administration's activities in Nicaragua said the Central Intelligence Agency had worked with some of Mr. Cruz's supporters to ensure that they would object to any potential agreement for his participation in the election. A few days before Election Day, some rightist parties on the ballot claimed that U.S. diplomats had been pressing them to drop out of the race. One of these, the Independent Liberal Party, had already announced that it was no longer in the running. Having exposed the administration's plan to sabotage the election's credibility, a plan centering around Arturo Cruz, and having reported the above about parties being pressured to drop out, the New York Times, after the election, inexplicably published an editorial which said in part, "Only the naive believe that Sunday's election in Nicaragua was democratic or legitimizing proof of the Sandinistas' popularity. The Sandinistas made it easy to dismiss their election as a sham. Their decisive act was to break off negotiations with Arturo Cruz, an opposition Democrat whose candidacy could have produced a more credible contest. The opposition was finally shrunk to 4 small left-wing groups and factions of 2 traditional parties. Even so, and after 5 years of unchallenged power, the Sandinistas appeared to have one less than 2/3 of the vote. The American ambassador to Costa Rica likened Nicaragua under the Sandinistas to an infected piece of meat that attracts insects. President Reagan called the country a totalitarian dungeon and insisted that the people of Nicaragua were more oppressed than blacks in South Africa. Members of the Kissinger Commission on Central America indicated that Nicaragua under the Sandinistas was as bad or worse than Nicaragua under Somoza. Henry Kissinger believed it to be as bad as or worse than Nazi Germany. Reagan was in accord. He compared the plight of the Contras to Britain's stand against Germany in World War II. Central America, noted Wayne Smith, former head of the U.S. Interest Section in Havana, now exercises the same influence on American foreign policy as the full moon does on werewolves. So all-consuming, so unrelenting, was the hatred that Kissinger demanded that the American ambassador to Nicaragua be removed simply because he reported that the Sandinista government was performing fairly well in such areas as education. And in the wake of the terrible devastation in Nicaragua wrought by Hurricane Joan in October 1988, the Reagan administration refused to send any aid nor to help private American organizations do so. So eager was the State Department to turn the Sandinistas into international pariahs that it told the world, without any evidence, that Nicaragua was exporting drugs, that it was anti-Semitic, that it was training Brazilian guerrillas. When the CIA was pressed about the alleged Sandinista drug connection, it backed down from the administration's claim. Secretary of State Alexander Haig referred to a photograph of blazing corpses and declared it an example of the atrocious genocidal actions that are being taken by the Nicaraguan government against the Mosquito Indians. We then learned that the photo was from 1978, Somoza's time. Loathing of this magnitude had to be institutionalized. Thus it was that an Office of Public Diplomacy was set up in 1983, nominally in the State Department, but operating as an arm of the National Security Council. The OPD was characterized by a U.S. official as a huge psychological operation of the kind the military conducts to influence a population in denied or enemy territory. Only in this case, the target population was the American people. OPD Deputy Director Colonel Daniel Jacobowitz, a military PSYOP specialist, described the media campaign in a March 1985 confidential sensitive strategy paper. Overall theme: the Nicaraguan freedom fighters, NFF, are fighters for freedom in the American tradition. FSLN, Sandinistas, are evil. Rolling off the OPD disinformation assembly line with the imagination of Oliver North ever active were stories about Nicaragua acquiring chemical weapons, an Iran-Nicaragua link, not to be confused with the real US/Oliver North Iran link we later learned of, a Soviet MiGs in Nicaragua hoax, the Sandinista massacre of 50 political prisoners, as well as a number of other claims, misleading at best. Opinion pieces and news stories prepared by OPD staffers or contractors were planted in major media outlets under the signatures of Contra leaders or ostensibly independent scholars, pretending to offer independent confirmation of White House claims, while other materials were distributed to thousands of university libraries, faculties, editorial writers, and religious organizations. Private sector public relations experts, lobbying groups, and think tanks were also enlisted for the cause and paid large chunks of taxpayer money to promote the OPD agenda. By OPD's own assessment, its work significantly changed public and congressional opinion, including winning approval in the House of $100 million in Contra aid in June 1986. Within a rational framework, it would be proper to inquire what the Sandinistas had done that made it impossible for the United States to share the same planet with them. David MacMichael observed that there was no casus belli between the two countries. There are no examples of U.S. citizens being killed there. No U.S. property has been expropriated without due process or compensation. These people are so backward that they haven't even bothered to kill any American priests or nuns. Now, any half-respectable country in the world can do that, but the Sandinistas don't seem to get round to it. What the United States did to the Nicaraguan Revolution is clearer. To transform Nicaraguan society, even if left in peace, would have been uphill all the way. The Sandinistas inherited a country of crushing poverty. Backward in most respects, there were reportedly but 2 elevators in Nicaragua, and with a foreign debt of $1.6 billion which they decided to honor, with the exception of money owed to Israel and Argentina for arms shipments to Somoza. Then came the American body blows to foreign trade and credit, to industry and agriculture, and a war which forced the government to devote an increasing portion of its national budget and an inordinate amount of its labor power to warfare and security. In 1980, half the national budget had been allocated to health and education, and military spending accounted for about 18%. By 1987, the military effort consumed more than half the budget, health and education less than 20%. On top of this, the historically familiar post-revolutionary flight abroad of capital and middle-class professionals, the equally familiar sabotage by those who remain, facile in a society where most of the businesses and farms were still in private hands, and the Nicaraguan economy went onto a life support machine, a trail of inefficiencies and shortages of all kinds, taxis and buses and machines grinding to a halt for want of an American spare part, a failure to meet the great expectations of the population, mitigated only partly by the progress in agrarian reform, healthcare, literacy, and other social programs Many who had been sympathetic to the revolution drifted away, some into protest and opposition. Individuals are turned away from or attracted to social revolutions for a multitude of reasons, ideological and/or personal. All must be approached with caution. The most prominent defector from the Sandinistas, Eden Pastora, in between semi-coherent political statements, declared that the Sandinistas attack me for my success with women, out of jealousy because they are all queer and I can make love to their women. Few U.S. officials now believe the Contras can drive out the Sandinistas soon, reported the Boston Globe in February 1986. Administration officials said they are content to see the Contras debilitate the Sandinistas by forcing them to divert scarce resources toward the war and away from social programs. 40 years of anti-communist indoctrination under Somoza and American cultural influence had also left their marks. A government militant put it this way: tell a Nicaraguan factory worker that we are building a system in which workers will control the means of production, in which income will be redistributed to benefit the proletariat, and he will say, yes, that's what we want. Call it socialism, and he will tell you he doesn't want any part of it. Tell a peasant, in whom the problem of political education is even more acute, that the revolution is all about destroying the power of the big latifundistas, that the agrarian reform and the literacy campaign will incorporate the peasantry into political decisions. And he will be enthusiastic, he will recognize that this is right, and just mention the word communism and he will run a mile. In the face of dissension, the Sandinistas often showed themselves unable to distinguish sincere and valid criticism from intentions to destabilize. Some opponents were harassed and jailed, civil liberties were curtailed, although never in a draconian manner. And credentials of loyalty to the revolution increasingly became a priority in filling positions high and low. This, interestingly enough, was precisely what was taking place in Washington at the same time, as the ultra-ideological Reagan administration was stuffing the bureaucracy with confirmed conservative loyalists. Subsequent disclosures, however, established that the Sandinistas were not simply paranoid. In September 1988, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Jim Wright, citing clear testimony from CIA people, revealed that the agency had employed people in Nicaragua to organize and promote anti-government rallies and protests in hopes of provoking a crackdown or some other overreaction by the government, which, besides making the Sandinistas look bad, was calculated to be disruptive to the peace talks that the Reagan administration was publicly supporting. The shutting down of the prominent opposition newspaper La Prensa on several occasions was also judged harshly by civil libertarians. But this policy raised an important historical question. During World War II, did the U.S. government allow the publication of pro-German or pro-Japanese newspapers in the United States? Has any government at war, particularly a war for its very survival, fought on its own soil, permitted the enemy to freely publish or broadcast at home, or allowed unrestricted dissent? During the American Civil War, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus and put enemy sympathizers in army jails without trial. La Prensa indeed represented the enemy. At various times in the 1980s, one of the paper's chief editors was Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, Jr. During part of the same time, he was a member of the directorate of a Contra umbrella group, the Nicaraguan Resistance of Washington, D.C. And Chamorro would go off on speaking tours in the United States to enlist support for the Contras. The newspaper was financed by the enemy as well, covertly by the CIA since 1979, and by millions of dollars from the National Endowment for Democracy, NED, in Washington and various private American groups beginning in 1984. NED receives its money from Congress and was set up in 1983 in the wake of all the negative revelations about the CIA in the 1970s. Its raison d'etre is to do somewhat overtly what the CIA had been doing covertly for decades: manipulate the political process in a target country by financing political parties, labor unions, book publishers, newspapers, etc., and thus, hopefully, eliminate the stigma associated with CIA covert activities. Alan Weinstein, who helped draft the legislation establishing NED, and also founded the Center for Democracy, one of NED's funding middlemen, was candid about this when he said in 1991, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. NED, like the CIA before it, calls what it does supporting democracy. The governments against whom the financing is targeted call it destabilization. In any event, covert funding did not pass away. Both the CIA and Oliver North's multifarious operation channeled large sums of money to anti-Sandinista politicians and other elements of the internal opposition, including, as we have seen, the Catholic Church. During a period in which military aid to the Contras was prohibited by Congress, North's network purchased large quantities of arms for the rebels from Mansour al-Qasr, a man whose U.S. criminal record labels him terrorist at the top of the page. Qasr was a known associate of those reputed to be responsible for the 1985 Christmas massacres in the Rome and Vienna airports, the hijacking of the liner Achille Lauro, and other notorious attacks. Another apostle of decency enlisted for the cause was the government of South Africa, which sent 200,000 pounds of military equipment to Contra leader Eden Pastora. By the time the war in Nicaragua began to slowly atrophy to a tentative conclusion during 1988 to 89, the Reagan administration's obsession with the Sandinistas had inspired both the official and unofficial squads to embrace tactics such as the following in order to maintain a steady flow of financing, weaponry, and other aid to the Contras. Dealings with other Middle Eastern and Latin American terrorists, frequent drug smuggling in a variety of imaginative ways, money laundering, embezzlement of U.S. government funds, perjury, obstruction of justice, burglary of the offices of American dissidents, covert propaganda to defeat domestic political foes, violation of the Neutrality Act, illegal shredding of government documents, plans to suspend the Constitution in the event of widespread internal dissent against government policy, and much more, as revealed in the phenomenon known as Iran/Contra. All of it to support the band of rapists, torturers, and killers known as the Contras. This, then, was the level of charm reached by anti-communism after 70 years of refinement. The imperial sensibility of America's leaders could be compared favorably with that of Britain circa 1925. But it worked. On February 25, 1990, the Sandinistas were defeated in national elections by a coalition of political parties running under the name National Opposition Union, UNO. President George Bush called it a victory for democracy. Senator Robert Dole declared that the final outcome is a vindication of the Reagan policies. Elliot Abrams, former State Department official and Iran/Contra leading light, said, "When history is written, the Contras will be folk heroes." The opposing analysis of the election was that 10 years of all-encompassing war had worn the Nicaraguan people down. They were afraid that as long as the Sandinistas remained in power, the Contras and the United States would never relent in their campaign to overthrow them. The people voted for peace, as the people of the Dominican Republic had voted in 1966 for the U.S.-supported candidate to forestall further American military intervention. "We can't take any more war. All we have had is war, 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 war," said Samuel Reyna, a driver for Jimmy Carter's election monitoring team in Jigalpa. In some families, one son has been drafted by the Sandinistas and another has joined the Contras. The war has torn families apart. The U.S. invasion and bombing of Panama just 2 months earlier, with all its death and destruction, could only have intensified the commitment of hardcore Sandinistas to resist Yankee imperialismo, but it could not have failed to serve as a caution to the large block of undecided voters. The Nicaraguans were also voting, they hoped, for some relief from the grinding poverty that 5 years of a full American economic embargo, as well as the war, had heaped upon their heads. Commented Paul Reichler, a U.S. lawyer who represented the Nicaraguan government in Washington at the time. Whatever revolutionary fervor the people once might have had was beaten out of them by the war and the impossibility of putting food in their children's stomachs. Aquí no se rinde nadie. For 10 years, the people of Nicaragua had shouted that slogan, "Here, no one gives up." But in February 1990, they did exactly that. Just as the people of Chile had chanted, "The people united will never be defeated," before succumbing to American power, the United States had more than war and embargo at its disposal to determine the winner of the election. The National Endowment for Democracy spent more than $11 million, directly and indirectly, on the election campaign in Nicaragua. This is comparable to a foreign government pouring more than $700 million into an American election, and is in addition to several million dollars more allocated by Congress to supporting the electoral infrastructure, and the unknown number of millions the CIA passed around covertly. As a result of a controversy in 1984, when NED funds were used to aid a Panamanian presidential candidate backed by Noriega and the CIA, Congress enacted a law prohibiting the use of NED funds, to finance the campaigns of candidates for public office. The ways to circumvent the letter and/or spirit of such a prohibition were not difficult to conceive. Ned first allocated millions to help organize UNO, building up the parties and organizations that formed and supported the coalition. Then a variety of other organizations, civic, labor, media, women's, etc., run by UNO activists received grants for all kinds of nonpartisan and pro-democracy programs for voter education, voter registration, job skills, and so on. Large grants made to UNO itself were specified for items such as office equipment and vehicles. Representative Silvio Conti of Massachusetts pointed out that the $1.3 million requested for vehicles would pay for renting 2,241 cars for a month at $20 per day. UNO was the only political party to receive U.S. aid, even though 8 other opposition parties fielded candidates. Money received by UNO for any purpose, of course, freed up their own money for use in the campaign and helped all of their candidates. Moreover, the U.S. continued to fund the Contras, some of whom campaigned for UNO in rural areas. Afterwards, critics of the American policy in Nicaragua called it a blueprint for successful U.S. intervention in the Third World. A Pentagon analyst agreed, "It's going right into the textbooks." 50. Panama 1969 to 1991. Double-crossing our drug supplier. El Chorrillo, that's what they called the tenement barrio in Panama City. 20,000 people had been packed into it. The December 1989 invasion, 10 hours of heavy assault, left 15,000 homeless. Marcia McFarland was asleep with her daughters when the assault on the nearby military building began. She was leading them out of her house when a shard of shrapnel took a pound of her thigh and all but tore off her 2-year-old daughter's foot. Artillery shells and rockets, tanks, machine guns and flamethrowers, and then the ground troops. The Yankee soldiers with their faces painted, they were all screaming, they looked like Indians. People burning to death in the incinerated dwellings, leaping from windows, running in panic through the streets, cut down in crossfire, crushed by tanks, human body fragments everywhere. Heriberto Pitti worked for Eastern Airlines. When U.S. troops attacked the airport, Pitti, Pablo Diaz, and another colleague jumped into an Eastern pickup and raced out of the hangar. The truck took 7 rounds through the windshield, killing all 3 men. Pitti left a widow and 2 daughters. Diaz left a widow and 12 children. 500-something Panamanian dead is the official body count, what the U.S. and Panamanian governments admit to. Other sources, with no less evidence, insist that thousands died, their numbers obscured in mass graves. 3,000-something wounded, 23 American dead, 324 wounded. Question from reporter: was it really worth it to send people to their death for this? To get Noriega? George Bush: every human life is precious, and yet I have to answer, yes, it has been worth it. Born to inform would be a suitable inscription on a t-shirt worn by Manuel Antonio Noriega. In his younger days, in the 1950s and early 60s, he was already passing on information to one or another U.S. intelligence agency about colleagues in a socialist party he belonged to, about leftist students at his Peruvian military academy. Noriega followed a military career, falling under the right mentor, National Guard General Omar Torrijos. On 2 occasions, the general had to intervene to save the ruthless Noriega from rape charges. In October 1968, Torrijos took power in Panama in a coup. He was, by Latin American standards, a not very brutal dictator. He was as well a liberal reformer who was wary of the excesses of North American power in Central America. In December 1969, conservative military officers tried, unsuccessfully, to overthrow Torrijos, claiming the government was heading toward a pro-communist dictatorship. Only hours before the coup attempt began, one of the principal plotters had met with a U.S. official. After the coup, the same plotter and others escaped from a high-security jail in a sophisticated commando operation and turned up in the U.S.-run Panama Canal Zone before going into exile in Miami. Noriega, who had proven his loyalty to Torrijos during the coup attempt, was soon elevated to head the intelligence unit of the National Guard. He was now in the right place to carry out all forms of mischief and enhance his reputation as a thug. As early as 1971, the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs, foreigner of the Drug Enforcement Administration, had hard evidence about Noriega's heavy involvement in drug trafficking, sufficient for indictment. But the legal and diplomatic obstacles involved were considerable, and Noriega was already too valuable to the CIA. President Nixon, however, wanted him removed. Among the options discussed to achieve this end was assassination. It went as far as sending a member of the infamous Plumbers unit to Mexico to await further orders to go to Panama and carry out the execution. But the would-be assassin got no further. During the Watergate hearings in 1973, former White House counsel John Dean testified that the White House had contracted E. Howard Hunt, former CIA officer and Watergate burglar, to assassinate Omar Torrijos because of his uncooperative stance on the Panama Canal Treaty negotiations and his government's role in drug trafficking. Inasmuch as Hunt may have been the plumber referred to above, and since Dean stated that Hunt had his team in Mexico before the mission was aborted, there is possibly some confusion here. Meanwhile, U.S. government cash, primarily that of the CIA and the Pentagon, was making its way into Manuel Noriega's bank accounts. With the exception of President Carter's term, 1977 to 81, the payments to Noriega continued until 1986. This included the period that George Bush was the director of the CIA, 1976, at which time the Panamanian intelligence chief was reportedly receiving in excess of $100,000 per year, and a lot of looking the other way. During the Panama Canal negotiations in October 1976, 3 bombs went off under cars parked in the canal zone. American officials believed that the bombings were an expression of nationalism carried out by Noriega's National Guard. Yet, in December, Bush met with the Panamanian in Washington and gave him a VIP tour of the CIA. Noriega spent his time in Washington as the house guest of Bush's deputy director, the infamous Vernon Walters. When Omar Torrijos died in an air crash in 1981, Noriega became part of a ruling military junta. In 1987, Colonel Robert Diaz Herrera, who was a cousin of Torrijos and had been one of the members of the junta, declared that Torrijos had died because of a bomb placed aboard his plane. Diaz named Noriega the CIA U.S. General Wallace Nutting, head of the U.S. Southern Command in Panama at the time of the air crash, and others as being part of the conspiracy. By August 1983, Noriega had maneuvered himself into the position of commander of the National Guard, whose name he soon changed to Panama Defense Forces. He was the effective chief of state, and his value to his American paymasters increased accordingly. 6 months earlier, the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations had reported that witnesses in Panama consider it common knowledge that the National Guard has links and receives payments from various traffickers in drugs, arms, and other kinds of contraband. In November, however, Noriega received the red carpet treatment in Washington, marked by luxury and meetings with officials of the White House, State Department, and Pentagon, and enjoyed a 4-hour lunch with CIA Director William Casey. Casey, probably Noriega's biggest supporter in Washington, met with the Panama strongman at least 6 times in Washington and Panama during the 1980s. Noriega earned Washington's money and tolerance over the years by providing numerous services, such as information about a host of regional matters, including his meetings with Fidel Castro and Daniel Ortega, giving haven to the Shah of Iran in December 1979, allowing the United States to set up listening posts in Panama, with which they monitored sensitive communications in all of Central America and beyond, and aiding the American warfare against the rebels in El Salvador and the government of Nicaragua. In the latter conflict, Noriega facilitated the flow of money and arms to the Contras, allowed the U.S. to base spy planes in Panama in clear violation of the canal treaties, gave the U.S. permission to train Contras in Panama. It is not certain that this actually took place, and provided information and direct action for the American campaign of sabotage inside of Nicaragua. But what information American officials wondered was the same Manuel Antonio Noriega giving Fidel Castro and Daniel Ortega about the United States. Washington already knew that he was helping Cuba circumvent the American economic embargo, and that at various times in his career, he'd helped to get weapons for the Sandinistas and for the guerrillas in El Salvador and Colombia, as well as transferring high technology to Eastern Europe. On June 12, 1986, the New York Times carried a front-page story recounting many of Noriega's questionable activities, including his drug trafficking and money laundering operations, and the murder of a political opponent. It was the most detailed and damning report on Noriega to appear in the U.S. media. Noriega assumed, probably incorrectly, that the article had the blessings of the White House. And though the Reagan administration reassured him that he need not be overly concerned about the story, the Panamanian felt threatened. In August, through a go-between, he proposed to Oliver North that, in exchange for a promise from Washington to help clean up his image and a commitment to lift the U.S. government ban on military sales to the Panamanian Defense Forces, imposed because of the Times article, Noriega would assassinate the Sandinista leadership. North evidently declined the offer, noting in a written memo that an executive order barred American participation in assassinations. However, as we have seen, the CIA in Nicaragua, not long before, had been engaged in precisely the same undertaking. The following month, North and Noriega met in London to discuss the latter's contribution to the Nicaraguan sabotage campaign. In return, North arranged for an American public relations firm to work on improving Panama's and Noriega's image. Noriega's principal periods of drug trafficking and money laundering appear to have been the early 1970s and the early 1980s, the latter period involving the Medellin, Colombia cartel. At other times, for reasons best known to his opportunistic self, he generally enforced the law against such activities. On his orders, Panamanian-flagged ships were searched in international waters, fugitive drug traffickers were sent to the United States for trial, and Panamanian banking laws were breached, all at the behest of American authorities. Noriega's American patrons were pleased. At various times, he received warm letters of praise from the State Department, the U.S. Southern Command in Panama, U.S. Attorney General William French Smith, CIA Director William Webster, and more than one DEA official. In 1987, more than a year after the New York Times had revealed his drug involvements in a front-page story, the head of the DEA, John Long, praised Noriega's personal commitment in helping to solve a major money laundering case. The same year found high U.S. law enforcement officials, including Long, working alongside Noriega at a meeting of Interpol, even advising him on how to achieve a better public image. Eventually, his luck ran out. A few enthusiastic DEA agents and U.S. attorneys, keeping a low profile, set the ball rolling in 1985 that eventually led to an indictment of Noriega in Florida on federal drug charges in February 1988. In the interim, the Iran-Contra scandal broke out, followed by congressional hearings, making it much more awkward for Noriega's prominent administration defenders, such as Oliver North and William Casey, to pull the strings of the law. Then, in November 1986, North was relieved of his duties. The following May, Casey died. In June, the Senate passed a resolution calling for Noriega's immediate removal. It passed over the objections of the administration. Ironically, it appears that Noriega had really gone straight. With one exception, a drugs for arms deal in March 1986. All the crimes he was indicted for in 1988 occurred in June 1984 or earlier. The DEA was deeply divided between those who investigated him as a criminal and those who swore by the authenticity of his cooperation with their agency. The Yankees, Noriega said shortly before they invaded, seemed to adore the product drugs, and then become upset with Latin Americans, as if we somehow were seducing them. Thus it was that the Reagan administration found itself with an indictment on its hands. The situation called for disassociation. George Bush, campaigning for the presidency in 1988, said repeatedly that he knew of no clear evidence that the Panamanian leader was involved in drugs until he was indicted. He also initially denied, but later acknowledged, that he had met with Noriega when he was CIA director in 1976. It should be noted that Bush was head of the Reagan administration's task force on drugs. It would clearly be better for all concerned if Noriega would step down. Consequently, the Reagan administration offered to drop the indictment if he resigned and went into exile. They isolated him diplomatically and undertook a campaign of severe and multifaceted economic sanctions against Panama. But Noriega held fast, although the sanctions eventually led to what the New York Times described as a festering economic depression and the collapse of thousands of businesses. In the summer of 1988, the United States drew up a covert plan for a group of dissident Panamanian officers to oust Noriega without violence. If this failed, the proposal called for the support of military action of a rebel force composed of a Panamanian military officer and his followers, who were in exile in Miami and on the CIA payroll. The Senate Intelligence Committee turned down the plan on the ground that it might result in the illegal assassination of Noriega. A presidential election was scheduled in Panama for May 1989, and the United States expected that it would be stolen for Noriega's candidate, as had been the case in the previous election of 1984. Accordingly, the CIA provided more than $10 million in aid to the opposition, as well as clandestine radio and television broadcasts. Noriega didn't disappoint his critics. When the ballot counting indicated his man losing heavily, he simply put an end to the whole process and allowed his goons to beat up opposition candidates and their supporters. Washington expressed its moral indignation about the fraudulent election, but this should be viewed in light of what had transpired 5 years earlier. In that election, Noriega's man, Nicholas Barletta, was declared the winner, the final count being announced 10 days after the election. The opposition cried fraud and demonstrated for weeks, but the results stood. The CIA, it turned out, along with the Medellin cocaine cartel, had helped finance Barletta's campaign. And after his victory, Barletta was welcomed by President Reagan to the Oval Office. Secretary of State George Shultz attended the inauguration, and heaven was in its place. Meanwhile, a political officer at the American Embassy in Panama was meticulously examining huge stacks of voting documents and reports he had managed to collect. His conclusion was inescapable.